we would know that they created that term. Not only it could serve, many things can be true at once, to serve like justifying keeping people enslaved, but also too as a way as like the strategy we just read here to control people's minds. So, and we look, there's this book on torture from slavery during that whole label of drapetomaniac and the tortures that they inflicted on people to get slaves, quote unquote, sane, and how the torture techniques they would use were to cause certain like reactions. So basically, like when they would get, there's this one story in particular, right? Of this person, enslaved African, they diagnosed with drapetomania. And the way they would torture him is through his feet. And they explain that the reason why they would do this is not because like, oh, you know, for shits and giggles. It's because, so what ended up happening is the way they tortured this guy is they damaged his feet, but they damaged his, how do I explain it? They damaged him in a way where he could still walk, he could still run, but the trauma inflicted on him in his mind made it so that he didn't walk, like he just would crawl everywhere. Man, when y'all read about slavery and the shit that they did, and then you think about it in terms of like, again, a genocide, an ongoing war, a protracted war, you'll look at that shit like very, very differently. You'll be like, what the fuck? So what is the American project? And no one would want to call themselves an American or wear that stupid ass fucking shit rag. But yeah, I'm gonna look for the book and I'm gonna make it a PDF and make it available because yeah, they literally go into detail on why certain torture techniques were used on enslaved Africans and the certain outcomes and how it was meant to make a better docile passive slave and how it wasn't a guess game, that it was a study, something they were perfected, revised over and over again. And it's important to understand it and for me to look back on it in that way because, again, it won't be so hard to see and believe prisoners when they describe prison as modern day slavery. And not just because of the free labor, but also the making of the slave. I'll keep reading. Administrators of these counterinsurgency projects are vehemently opposed to the idea that ordinary people are capable of thinking for themselves, deciding what is in their own best interest, or autonomously acting on their own thoughts. They saw intelligent, politically revolutionary, and charismatic individuals as vectors of a dehistoricized political contagion that mechanically infected an otherwise healthy social order, and the broader population as mere drones who must be reprogrammed by political and technical elites. Sick. So yeah, basically, they say revolutionaries have drapetomania, and that they're basically the rotten apple spoiling the bunch, and that once you isolate them from the rest of the people, that you can pretty much get the rest of the people act like sheep and nothing and preserve empire. That's basically their mindset of these programs and these people who ran them. Instead of seeing people capable of autonomy to be able to be self-determining for themselves, that the reason why they rebel is not because someone tricked them into rebelling, but they were like, yo, I can't eat, I can't afford food, I can't afford housing, so therefore I'm coming for your food and your housing and your head, which is intelligent. Dora bin, Daruba bin Wahad was a confirmed prisocrat target, and his description of the program's goals sounds a lot like Messiah's description of what the RX program aimed to achieve. At a population level, Prisoncrat aimed to destroy the development of revolutionary consciousness within the prison. At an individual level, it meant to break the minds and the spirits of specific targets who belonged to the class of imprisoned revolutionaries. Describing his experience to an interviewer in 1990, he said, to do this, they engage in constant psychological battles, constant psychological torture, and constant attempts to isolate me from the community and from other prisoners. Shortly after his 1973 conviction on the attempted cop-killing frame-up, FBI surveillance followed Dhoruba into prison. Upon their instruction, DOCS circulated a memo that rearticulated the Bureau's social Darwinist understanding of political education. They stressed that Daruba should be afforded considerably more than average custodial supervision, and that he not be assigned to any area where he might exert undue influence on the weaker element. The memo exposes the Bureau's elitist conception that by isolating people like Daruba, prison programmers would be able to mold the passive majority like clay. Although the theory was flawed, state actors were right to be concerned. Daruba and others were aware of their strategy and labored to expose it at every turn. A prime example comes in the form of Message to the Black Movement, a political statement from the Black Underground, a pamphlet attributed to NYU RBA. And I have that. If you go in the media section of my page and type that in, it should come right up as a space. I have to scan it to make a PDF, and so that, oh, I think I already did. I do have the PDF. I think if you do the same thing and type in PDF in the library, it should come right up. But which was written by Daruba circa 1976. The pamphlet offers a materialist analysis of the historical conjecture, including the ramifications of rapidly advancing technological capacity concentrated in the hands of a few and the continued necessity of underground formations such as the BLA. However, it also theorizes what I have called programification as a key tactic in the state's ongoing attempt to control, eliminate, and induce particular ways of being Black. As it stands now, Black people cannot even conceive of real freedom. We are afraid of real liberation because we have been programmed to be afraid by racist class oppression, Daruba writes. Although aware of behavior modification initiatives like the RX program, his critique focuses on more ordinary and thus seductive tactics of thought control. As university-sponsored education programs were flooding the post-Attica prison, he wrote that education has always been another method of programming Black people into the lowest strata of capitalist society, ensuring generations of exploitative and marginal labor. These institutionally sponsored education programs were increasingly competed with the threatening forms of self-directed Black study that gave rise to the revolt. In order to break these psychological class chains of the 20th century enslavement, we must build a revolutionary culture that not only programs our minds out of oppression, but at the same time impels us against the enemy class and culture. Revolutionaries were also talking about programming the population, but unlike that of the state, theirs was not a paternalistic, elitist top-down approach, but a consensual approach to deprogram and reprogram besieged communities from the bottom up. In July of 1974, the FBI convened a national symposium on the American penal system as a revolutionary target. Gathered at the Bureau's training academy in Quantico, Virginia, prison officials from across the United States joined representatives from Congress and various federal agencies. Among their topics of discussion were the historical development of various revolutionary movements within and beyond the prison and the practice of guerrilla warfare. Prisax codified the prison as war on a national level. Grab some water. Present at the symposium was Bertram, that's his name, Bertram S. Brown, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Back in 1961, Brown had attended the Power to Change Behavior, and after hearing a presentation on coercive persuasion, he issued what amounted to a national mandate for prison administrators to experiment on Vilcrouchant, I butchered that word, Black Muslims. Following the revolutionary target 13 years later, Brown issued another experimental mandate. He called for greater research in the field of revolutionary propaganda, with a particular focus on which of the prisoners were particularly susceptible to this material, which would become radicalized, which would become leaders in radical movements, and for what reasons. Illuminating the ongoing function of prisons as laboratories for developing methods of control aimed beyond prison walls, Brown explained that the findings of this research would be broadly applicable since any understanding of those who do respond to these revolutionary concepts might give us a targeted place to find answers to questions involving our general society. The imperatives of carceral war are never separate from those of empire. Let me read that shit again. The imperatives of carceral war are never separate from those of empire, meaning all the programs and experiments done to our people held captive by the state, that is all a part of empire and necessary. So when they hide it behind the veneer of, oh, these are criminals, these are people who break laws, we have to expand the prison state in order to protect y'all from yourself, that's a lie. They're just colonizing us. This is just settler colony, and this is just a settler colony, and we're in an open air prison. And you gotta wake that shit up. And they know it, which is why they continue on doing things the way that they do. And then they study us in a process so they can keep revising the strategy and the plan to keep on oppressing us and repressing us. The FBI terminated prison cracks on August 16, 1976, just over 2 years after its initiation, and just before Dhoruba lawsuits forced the FBI to disclose the program's existence. Real quick, I want to make sure I say, because oftentimes when people hear people analyze the state, they think, man, y'all are describing something that is all powerful, omnipresent, and all knowing. No. The reason why they have to study people and in order to revise their strategy to violently maintain empire is because people keep resisting. So they'll put a plan in place of repression, right? And then there's a resistance, and it builds and it grows, and people challenge it. And they're like, wait a goddamn minute. So now we got to go back to the drawing board and keep revising. And that's an ongoing struggle. And when we look at it that way as an ongoing struggle, that when we analyze the state, we're not saying that these things in which we point out aren't, evidence of it being, invincible. It's actually evidence of it being destructible and that we can actually destroy it in our lifetime. So I just want to make sure I'm clear when I be pointing this shit out. Yes, they be revising their plans, but they revise their plans because people keep resisting. And there's pockets of direct action, and there's pockets of revolutionary education and raising the political consciousness that constantly threatens the system to where it has to keep revising. So look at it as the state becomes more repressive, as it starts, the noose of fascism tighten around our neck. Look at it as a giant going backwards, and the best time to hit someone square in the jaw is when they're stepping back, and so. Of course, hitting someone square in the jaw would be revolution in this example. The FBI terminated prison cracks on August 16, 1976, just over 2 years after its initiation, and just before Dhoruba's lawsuit forced the FBI to disclose the program's existence. Similar to how prison-based behavior modification programs were formally discontinued only to be reconstituted under a new guise, counter-revolutionary FBI methods were absorbed into a series of state agencies with intelligence functions. New York's localized versions of Priscratz was based in the Office of the Inspector General and administered in concert with the Bureau of Criminal Investigation and the Division of Criminal Justice Services, which absorbed NYSIIS in 1972. Established the same year, the IGO was another in a long line of post-Attica reforms that aimed to enhance carceral power through concessions, disingenuously disguised as wins, quote unquote, for anti-carceral activists. DOCS initially presented the IGO as a mechanism for ensuring compliance with the state and federal law, for investigating incarcerated people's complaints, and for ensuring that agreed upon reforms were implemented effectively. However, the IGO performed extensive intelligence functions. It tracked the movements, association, and ideas of political radicals across prison walls and maintained centralized dossiers, which is shared with the NYPD, the New York State Police, the FBI, and what eventually evolved into the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Okay? I want to encourage anyone listening to this recording to purchase this book for yourself and also purchase a copy for someone locked up. Now, you can't order it through Amazon because they don't accept, a lot of prisons don't accept books from Amazon. You would have to go through an independent dealer. My goal is to send 50 copies to those locked up, and of course across the prison industrial complex, meaning Kids locked up are going to get a copy. Women locked up. And of course, other marginalized genders locked up. And then, of course, I already sent it to a couple of cis men locked up as well. Not only did the sprawling state intelligence apparatus collect intelligence, it weaponized it. Years after leaving NYSIIS in 1973, Dr. Robert Gelati made his point clear. He explained that emerging computer technology facilitated new counterintelligence methods against special threats, in quotes, of organized crime and terrorism, common euphemism for Black radical struggle. Among these methods were what Gelati termed subversions, tactical actions calculated to breed internal dissension or to create distrust and suspicion and disruption. Concentrated efforts to disrupt or dislocate organized crime activities. Moreover, Gelati stressed that these methods were best deployed as part of a flexible and imaginative counterintelligence repertoire that was effective for defense as well as offense. Interestingly, the book in which Gelati describes these methods features a laudatory foreword from William Colby, the former head of the CIA's pacification program in Vietnam, who became director of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1973, again presenting us with the absent presence of the CIA in development of carceral technology. God damn. And that's the thing too, is that what pisses me off the most is when people don't practice de-arrest and when people just put up their phone and watch people get kidnapped by state agents. It makes no sense to me, but it is because we are grossly miseducated on what prisons are and how they function in empire. That a lot of activists are being locked up are not only being tortured, but studied. And they're being studied and how they respond to the environment and the torture that they're, in that they're inflicted to, but so that they could see the outcomes and the reaction to that torture so that they can then use methods in social engineering us and quelling rebellion on the outside. A vicious ass cycle. So every time there's revolt, you capture those who are leaders or who you see as revolutionary, torture them, see their response to certain stimuli, study it, write it down, and then use it to create programs so you can subdue rebellion for the next 100 years. Some sick shit. So if you are going out there in any kind of protest, I need you to start practicing de-arrest. Not one more person. It don't even have to be protests. You be seeing someone pulled over by the police. Like, not one more. And when people start practicing that, then that's when you know that the political consciousness has risen to the point where we understand exactly the role of police, the role of empire and institutions under empire, and we understand our role in stopping it. The next part is called carceral counterintelligence. As I have described elsewhere, evidence suggests that Prizaks involved assassinations, most of which seem to have been carried out or attempted soon after a target was released from prison. While this is certainly a critical aspect of state repression, here I am interested in how state actors sought to control the circulation of Black radical ideas, thoughts, desires, and representations through what I call counterintelligence. Commonly unhyphenated, I use the term for two reasons. I want to stress that despite the various, that's a word I've never seen before, the various nomenclature, boom. I want to stress that despite the various nomenclature reforms, institutional reconfigurations, and administrative devolutions, all of which provide a veneer of plausible deniability, this state-based intelligence apparatus is a descendant of COINTELPRO and related programs of domestic war. Second, counterintelligence speaks to the tactical imperatives of this war on Black revolutionary minds, how state actors, in a literal sense, attempt to counter the intelligence of incarcerated people to eliminate their capacity for autonomous actions and self-governance, and to criminalize threatening ideas and even non-threatening ones that are not explicitly permitted by the state. For prisoncrats, the most threatening idea was that which imprisoned Black revolutionaries understood to be indispensable, the BLA. After gunning down BLA member Tawan Wyman, I don't know how to say that name, sorry, Twan Myers, in 1973, the NYPD announced that it broke the back of the organization. Damn, I know that name, but I'm drawing a blank. COVID is a bitch. However, key members maintained that the BLA was not an organization, but rather an idea. As Deruba explained in a 1973 interview, the importance of the BLA lies not in its size, not in its ability to muster so much firepower or whatever. The importance of it lies in the concept. The concept is basically this: that revolutionary armed struggle is a very vital aspect of any progressive movement for revolutionary change. Asked under oath if he was a member of the BLA, Albert, Albert Noah Washington made a similar point. All the Black people that struggle for the liberation of their people are members of this organization, but it's a concept more than an actuality. So too did Assata Shakur in her autobiography. There is and always will be, until every Black man, woman, and child is free, a Black liberation army. BLA combatant theorists apprehended the historical dynamics of the permanent war within which all Black and colonized people were ensnared, whether they were locked behind prison walls or moving throughout the so-called free world, in quotes. After deep study and political engagement, they concluded that it was imperative for the historical victims of this racial colonial war to develop the capacity to respond to it strategically. Prisocrats understood that unless they eradicated this concept, they would never be fully in control, and therefore employed invasive surveillance that aimed to decipher who belonged to what category of prisoner. The problem had grown more complex since Galati authored his letter to Rockefeller back in 1971. By 1977, New York State prisons confined several Black Panther Party, BLA, Black Liberation Army political prisoners, including Deruba, Robert Seth Hayes, Teddy Jah Heath, and Elmore Baba Odinga Thompson. Sorry, I need water. Noah Washington, Herman Bell, and Jalil Montequim. Moreover, dispersed throughout the system was a much larger and more difficult to identify population of what the IGO called BLA associates, those who exhibited close association with BLA political prisoners and who were said to be involved in organizing activities through shared use of couriers and through shielded communications between each other. Finally, there was a large contingent of incarcerated people with direct and indirect ties to the armed forces of national liberation, a revolutionary formation that carried out a variety of clandestine armed actions to support the Puerto Rican independence movement during the mid-1970s and early 1980s. It was the responsibility of DOCS, localized prisocrats, infrastructure, the IGO, the DCJS, and BCI to maintain a politically advantageous disruption of this militant minority across Auburn, Attica, Comstock, Clinton, and Greyhaven prisons. As I showed in the previous chapter, DOCS post-Attica prison expansion plan prioritized the construction of minimum and medium security prisons in an effort to create carceral spaces where the programmable, weaker element could be disaggregated from the intractable radicals and revolutionaries. That's interesting because if you think about it in that way, so they said minimum security prisons and medium security prisons were created for the quote unquote weaker element of of captive populations, ones that could be swayed and basically incentivized to assimilate to the status quo. If we think about it in that way, and again, we're in a protracted war, that then when the state gives concessions, we should see that as bait for the weaker minded of us, the ones who are willing to, be class traders, those who are willing to sell out, and then we would know exactly what to do. That's all I'm going to say. But it's interesting. So we shouldn't see concessions as wins, is basically what many people and theorists and revolutionaries have constantly told us. Concessions are not wins. It's bait. It's to trap the weaker element of the oppressed class, the ones that are willing to sell out, and then the ones that are willing to become the buffer class and therefore protect the state by any means necessary and be trained to do so. and oftentimes then go back into the populace and then become, not only cops, but, misinformation and campaigns and all kinds of shit. So, and co-opting movements. I keep going. While this psychological warfare strategy may have contributed to the reduction of riot-inducing tensions. Yeah, that's right. Let me start over on that one. While the psychological warfare strategy may have contributed to the reduction of riot-inducing tensions, in quotes, as carceral planners intended, it left them with only 5 maximum security prisons across which to distribute those who not only seemed impervious to state programming, but were believed to possess the capacity to program others. Further complicating matters was that DOCS maintained an unofficial policy that no 2 members of the BLA's upper echelon could be confined in the same prison at the same time. The result was a frantic strategy akin to a repressive game of musical chairs in which political prisoners were ceaselessly moved in and out of solitary confinement and shuffled between New York's most oppressive prisons. This was achieved using illegal covert actions disguised as disinterested penal administration. As I have already shown, because of its proximity to New York City, its relatively quote unquote loose atmosphere, and its array of programming offerings, Green Haven functioned as an institutional carrot when juxtaposed to ultra repressive prisons like Clinton, Comstock, and Attica. However, by the late 1970s, captives began noticing a retrenchment of these programs and an intensification of repression. A telling example occurred in 1978 when the shoe cell of Sunni Muslim captive named Musa Abdul Mumin mysteriously caught fire and, according to eyewitness accounts, was allowed to burn for several minutes before guards came to his aid. Musa, who witnessed this claim, was sent to the shoe after observing a KKK meeting involving the guards, later died in the hospital. His death was not an isolated incident. A few days earlier, Pedro Arroyo, another Greenhaven captive, died after complaining of stomach pains in what many saw as suspicious circumstances, as guards were known to threaten to poison those who got out of line. The IGO opened investigations into these deaths and another into what was later revealed to be a bad pattern of corruption and malfeasance by Greenhaven personnel, including the facilitation of extortion, drug distribution, gambling, prostitution, theft, and escapes. However, despite these compounding crises, the intelligentsia chief priority was to keep BLA political prisoners isolated from the captive majority and banish their revolutionary ideas from the carceral system. From the time I arrived in 1979, Greenhaven and BLA control were synonymous, recalled Thomas A. Cullen in a sworn disposition. Immediately after assuming the new role as commissioner of DOCS, the former New York State trooper sat for the first of what would be countless meetings with the IGO, whose main responsibility to me via Greenhaven at the time, was to keep me apprised of the activities of the Black Liberation Army and their relationship to radical groups on the street. As the commissioner explained, IGO analysts walked him through a very complicated mosaic of intelligence, ultimately convincing him that with support from the FLAN BLA political prisoners had subverted their authority and were using coercion and threats to secretly control the population. Their plan, the authorities claimed, was to set the prison ablaze, seize hostages, and immediately execute them, or as Colin explained, to carry out the overthrow of the institution and create another Attica. This formulation speaks to the state's flawed theory of knowledge, its disingenuous historical memory, and the indispensability of the Long Attica framework advanced throughout this book. Nearly a decade after it occurred, the Attica Rebellion and Massacre continued to function as a paradigm that shaped political struggle within the walls. For imprisoned revolutionaries, Attica represented a watershed moment in the development of prisoner unity and collective radical struggle against racist and gendered state repression. By contrast, state actors positioned the rebellion as an unwanted terrorist attack against the state. Their discourse, and that of the elite media, is characterized by a pathological revision that frames Attica as one of the bloodiest prison riots in U.S. history, or some uh, derivation thereof, conveniently leaving out that the fact that it was the state and not the rebels that piled most of the blood in their ferocious repression of the rebellion. Nonetheless, state actors invoke Attica as a reminder of the profound trauma they experienced at losing control of a potent symbol of white power and masculinity. They are obsessed with Attica because of what it meant and still means to them. IGO intelligence framed its struggle against this alleged BLA takeover as a kind of war by proxy. At the center of this struggle was an inmate organization called the Creative Communications Committee. As stated in their intelligence reports, the CCC began as a legitimate organization and pursued the legitimate purpose of parole reform. However, by the fall of 1978, when Dhoruba became vice president, the IGO noted the infiltration of the CCC and possibly its complete takeover by the Black Liberation Army was well underway and possibly complete. This reference to infiltration is a tactic admission that a covert war was unfolding. And as I have already shown, prisoncrats employed inmate organizations as a means of infiltrating the prison movement, as a Trojan horse meant to disseminate conservative ideology and program the population's embrace of what Queen Mother Moore termed tame institutional politics. When Dhoruba became involved in the CCC, prisoncrats grew fearful, not only that militants had infiltrated their infiltration strategy, but that they were countering state programming with programs of their own. So real quick, so let me explain what happened. So basically there was this program that was supposed to be like a kind of liberal program for the inmates. It wasn't supposed to be revolutionary. Dhoruba bin Wahad infiltrated it and became vice president and basically turned the bitch out. and other BLA members infiltrated, right? Or those with revolutionary liberation for their aims. And so what happened is that when the institution got word of this, they were like, oh no, they infiltrated our program we created to infiltrate, the rebellions in prison, revolutionaries in prison. And so Queen Mother Moore talks about how a lot of these programs exist, especially the ones that have been co-opted and serve like a liberal purpose. They exist as infiltration to stop revolts and rebellion. Because remember, as in violent conditions, you're bound to have resistance. So if we accept that as inevitable, they have to create programs to stifle that resistance. So what happens is if we look at those programs as infiltrating, and acting as a Trojan horse, like he quotes, as a Trojan horse meant to disseminate conservative ideology and program the population to embrace what Queen Mother Moore called the tame institutional politics. So they would create these programs to infiltrate prison resistance movements, disseminate conservative ideology, so that, again, it could be just institutional politics, nothing that threatens the state. And we see that with a lot of things. Reparation was co-opted in the same exact way, where you have these reactionary groups called FBA and Secure the Tribe, and they also call themselves the Freemen too, were literally used to infiltrate reparations, use it as a Trojan horse to inoculate people with conservative ideology. Now within the reparations movement, you have people not identifying with Africa and also saying that they are against African immigrants as well as Black immigrants from wherever part of the world they may come from, basically becoming lapdogs of white supremacy. You even have some of these people in the groups have spaces where they recruit people to work for ICE. And those are recorded spaces here on this app. So again, practice on the revolutionaries that were kidnapped by the state in the 60s and 70s to create a strategy to use on us on the outside to squash our rebellions and our resistance. On December 16, 1978, after the state's attempt to pressure CCC members to sever their relationship to Dhoruba failed, prisoncrats shipped him to Unit 14. 4 days earlier, an administrator had written, "It is extremely imperative that Richard Moore, Dhoruba's slave name, be transferred from this facility immediately. He's quite gifted in his speech and ability to arouse others into becoming involved in violent behavior. If left unattended at Greenhaven, he will most definitely organize a front to overtake the facility through violent means. Protesting his treatment in a letter to Robert Nelepowitz, who had been taken hostage during the Auburn Rebellion, Deruba identified what he saw as the actual reason for his transfer: to exhibit to all prisoners that my type of attitude would not be allowed to become contagious. And again, that is such an important point that Deruba makes, because we're oftentimes fed the narrative that we need a leader, that there would be a one kind of Messiah that will come, and that when that person presents themselves, you don't scrutinize them, you don't critique them, because when we get another leader, right? That plays into the hands, and that actually is state propaganda that we just read about, and how they convince us that each of us is not capable of autonomy, of not capable of analyzing our material conditions and coming to the result that we need to get free by any means necessary. That there's an agitator that we set up. When in actuality, when they remove that so-called, agitator or kill that leader, it's not because it's not only because it'll stop a movement, but also as a public lynching and display to say, hey, this is what happens if you think about becoming human under a system we designed to dehumanize you. So I love that Deruba put words to that and named it exactly for what it was. It's not because I'm some special Negro. It's they wanted to use me as an example to deter the already resistance that was forming. If left unattended at Greenhaven, he will most definitely I think I already read that. Let me find my place. Boom. Aware of the guard's fragile hold on power, Deruba closed his missive by invoking Attica. He wrote that attempts to isolate people like him from the captive majority only ensure future Atticas, and in this sense, you are correct to do what you have done. I know that's right. Pressure from Deruba's legal and political support campaign forced prisoncrats to release him into Clinton's general population, creating a new problem. Albert Washington was already in Clinton, convicted in 1975 for the slaying of 2 NYPD patrolmen. Washington, along with Jalil Montcalm and Herman Bell, were considered to be among the BLA's upper echelon. It is unclear what prisoncrats believe would happen if these 2 men were allowed to be in the same prison at the same time. Perhaps their combined powers of influence would prove too much for the DOCS to contain, instantly breaking their spell over the captive majority. We'll never know. A few days after Deruba hit the general population, Nell was warned that he was being set up. Later that day, prisoncrats, quote-unquote, discovered what they claimed was a bomb in his cell. In a June 28 letter to his attorney, Deruba explained, informal reports on my end indicate that the opposition may have employed BCI in setting him up. Also, all of his legal papers, letters, etc. destroyed, confiscated, or copied. Opposition claims ongoing investigation, although it was later revealed that the mysterious device was not a bomb. Nell spent 6 months in Unit 14, where he was effectively quarantined from his comrade and from the general population, a major chess piece removed from the board, a crisis influence averted. Meanwhile, Jalil Montcalm had been in Attica since late 1977. 11 months later, he was accused of organizing the so-called Attica Brigade, an underground formation intent on physically retaliating against abusive guards. Jalil spent 2 months in solitary confinement before being shipped to Auburn, where he was written up for leading the Muslim population in an illegal outdoor prayer ceremony. In late 1979, he was transferred to Greenhaven, where, much to the administration's dismay, he was promptly elected to a leadership position in the CCC, conveniently neglecting the fact that the population had elected Deruba and Jalil to leadership position in the organization. Commissioner Cullen testified that their ascent was achieved via threats, strong-arm tactics, and internecine violence, and that state intervention was necessary to prevent harm to incarcerated people, prison staff, and state property. So basically, here's another example of everything they say the rebels are guilty of is what they were doing, projection. And we see that all the time, especially across imperialist projects and them trying to colonize people. And they often say the resistance is these horrible people that did these atrocities and this atrocities. And what ends up coming out? It's actually the imperialists who did all that, and the colonizer and the settler. Jalil describes the administration's claim that he and Dhoruba were using the CCC to build a secret BLA network that aimed to seize Green Haven and launch a massacre, a flat-out lie intended to facilitate a priscrat agenda and justify severe repression. At the same time, he acknowledges that he and others were aware that the inmate organization program was subterfuge designed to pinpoint who was organizing in the prison and allow the administration to contain their organizing in a way that was effective for the modus operandi of the prison itself. Based on this understanding, he and others performed their CCC work while at the same time they used the official organization for unofficial organizing. Fucking military strategist, you hear this? Jalil maintained that the underground, unsanctioned objective of the CCC was to organize the population to collectively withhold their labor, to protest working conditions and recent curtailments of visitation privileges. This was the extent of their conspiracy, he explained. However, through the state's war on Black revolutionary minds, the ideas and thoughts behind a given action were prioritized over the action itself. What concerned Colin and others was the CCC members were not primarily thinking about parole reform, the official focus of their organization. They were thinking about war, and worse, they were actively concealing their criminalized thoughts. Soon after Jalil assumed leadership in the organization, prisoncrats and the IGO began noticing that captives in multiple Green Haven cell blocks were wearing buttons emblazoned with the new CCC logo. The buttons featured a pyramid with an apex hovering slightly above the base and an all-seeing eye in the center, much like the image on the back of a $1 bill. Within the pyramid's base were 3 circles, each featuring a small C and a much larger stick figure character. Decoding the icons with the help of a confidential informant, the IGO eventually realized that they were replete with BLA iconography and revolutionary symbolism. An intelligence summary pointed out the similarity between the CCC pyramid and the pyramid depicted in the BLA's newly unveiled logo, which unbeknownst to them, Dhoruba had drawn a few years earlier while in Green Haven. They further surmised that the stick figures within each circle were positioned in postures resembling letters, and that when deciphered, the letters spelled war. We wanted to raise the consciousness of our constituents, of our fellow incarcerated men, and help them see what we were engaged in a process of war, Jalil explained after I showed him the IGO surveillance report. His counter strategy speaks to the very essence of this psychological war, a confrontation that revolves around concepts, knowledge, and consciousness rather than physical territory. Using various technologies of coercion, manipulation, and programming, the state aimed to pacify the population by mystifying the idea that a war was unfolding, by enveloping its violence within liberal discourses of process and correction and reform and education and rehabilitation. Imprisoned revolutionaries were trying to help the population cut through these layers of obscurity and reveal that the war was not over, that it had only transformed in sophisticated ways, that violence continued to saturate the system but was unequally distributed throughout the population. Afflicted with a pathological amnesia regarding the imperialist and white supremacist origins of this war, state actors necessarily interpret oppressed people's understandings of war as declarations of war against normative peace. Moreover, they project their own genocidal conceptions of war onto the populations they subject to genocide. New York Attorney General Robert Abram later cited the buttons as evidence that a hardcore group of inmates composed of CCC members, radical inmates, and general malcontents were attempting to force, via the use of coercive means, other inmates into supporting a violent confrontation with the prison authorities. Abrams, Collin, and the IGO claimed on July 28, 1980, Jalil and the CCC would launch their carefully planned conspiracy to inaugurate their Attica-like rebellion. Grab some water. On the morning of July 20th, 1980. 8 days before this planned rebellion was allegedly set to occur, Green Haven's captive population entered the prison's east and west mess halls, picked up their trays and utensils, but walked through the food line without filling their plates. Instead, they sat at their tables in total silence. This simple act of collectively refusing to eat, a nonviolent protest tactic employed across historical and geographic contexts, filled the prison hierarchy with dread. Actors on both sides of the struggle understood that in the New York prison system, refusing to eat had special significance. It conjured images of the Attica Rebellion, which was preceded by a silent fast in honor of George Jackson. Their collective refusal to eat signified a refusal of the state's knowledge and programs and the harboring of secrets that the state's technologies of surveillance could not assess. For the state, this was unacceptable. The day after the strike, in response to this seething internal situation, as the Attorney General described it, prison crafts unleashed the tried and true method that had undergirded their mind experiments all along: violence. Under Cullen's orders, Greenhaven was placed on total lockdown, and the CRT executed a brutal transfer of 40 captives, all of whom, according to the state, were violence-prone, radical CCC and BLA leaders, their more active followers, and their inmate sympathizers and general malcontents. Dispositions from Charles Merriweather and Charles Butler, who were shackled together at the wrist and ankle and shipped to Comstock, offer a glimpse of what the Greenhaven 40, as they came to be known, endured at the hands of the state. As their bus entered Comstock's main gate, Butler and others beheld approximately 25 to 30 officers standing in the bottom of a hill, and all of them had extra long sticks, and they were swinging them as if they were having baseball practice. Perched atop a guard tower, they spotted a sharpshooter who was peering at them through the scope of his rifle, pretending to shoot. Aware of Comstock's reputation for racial terror, Butler became petrified with fear that they either intended to kill us or beat us so bad that we would wish for death. One by one, pairs of captives were physically dragged from the bus, assailed with racist vitriol, and viciously beaten in view of the others. Their bruised and bloody bodies were then carried into the prison, where they were stripped of their clothing and forcibly shaved of their head and facial hair. After being inspected by a physician who ignored their flesh wounds, the captives were confined to the shoe. In a political prisoner's journey through the U.S. prison system, Jalil Montequim, who transferred a few days later, writes about his similarly brutal dislocation from Greenhaven, as well as his continued resistance in and out of various isolation units. Years later, during the Greenhaven's 40s class action lawsuit against DOCS, authorities claimed that their preemptive action forestalled a rebellion, sparing the personnel and the inmate population of Greenhaven from a potential bloodbath. However, Cullen explained that the ultimate goal of the CCC's organizing was inconsequential. He testified that the central issue was that militants and revolutionaries had control over the thoughts and behaviors of the population, which meant that they could have organized a massacre if they wanted to. Echoing theorist Walter Benjamin's assertion that the state will always interpret general strikes as symbolic acts of violence, Cullen explained that it could be construed as a terrorist act. He went on, when the inmates in a maximum security prison have enough strength and enough organization to shut down that institution, in other words, make the inmate population do its will, that in my opinion is a takeover of that institution, because it was just at the whim of the leadership that hostages weren't taken or people weren't killed. Similarly, when pressed to produce a single shred of evidence showing that the BLA or anyone else had done or were planning to do anything illegal under the auspices of the CCC, Assistant Inspector General Paul Garcia testified that it is unlawful for inmates to organize within the prison system. This was clearly untrue, as captives were actively encouraged to organize in ways that facilitated the state's continued control. The state's rationalization of its surveillance and repression exposes the ideological continuity running through the running through this constantly mutating assault on Black revolutionary minds. While mind control, behavior modification, and thought reform programs officially belong to a bygone era, the fact that CCC members were terrorized for committing thought crimes shows that prisocrats continue to pursue these imperatives under different guises. Administrators of the counterinsurgent prison see physical confinement as insufficient for order. Over and above this minimum condition for control is the imperative of negating the captive's independent will, of subjecting them on psychological, physiological, and ideological, affective, and libidinal, I don't know how to say that word, levels of rendering them incapable of thinking, feeling, or acting in ways that are not explicitly allowed by the state. Though disguised as disinterested prison administration, DOCS colluded with the national security state to facilitate unethical medical experimentation, illegal covert action techniques, and brutal terror to disrupt their cognitive autonomy and foreclose Black radical future. Damn. I think this is the last, this is the last section, so I'll go ahead and read it real quick. Control units, a coda, that's the name of this section. On November 7th, 1975, Messiah and Zuri Mugbuk were captured in Minneapolis by what Messiah called an army of FBI and police Gestapo armed to kill. 5 years later, in an essay entitled Profile of a Revolutionary Married Couple, Messiah declared that he and Zuri belonged to the Republic of New Africa and the Black Liberation Army and had been engaged in efforts to establish armed clandestine formations throughout the Black colonies within the continent of Euro-America. They were brought to New Jersey to stand trial for the murder of Oscar Lowett, a store operator who had been fatally shot near the Mammoth Park racetrack on July 5th. And yet, because they were under 24-hour surveillance, the state knew the Mugmuks did not carry out this murder, Messiah argued. Rather, the charge was part of a conspiracy that aimed to frame us for whatever crime or crimes conducive to taking us out of Revolutionary Commission or facing the music of violent death. Along with a man named O'Neal Davis, Messiah and Zuri were indicted for first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The state's narrative was that Lowett's wife hired the trio to assassinate her husband for infidelity. Held on a $100,000 bail, the Mugmuks pleaded not guilty. They maintained that they were the targets of a frame-up, Messiah for the second time in his life, after a 7-day prosecution that relied on the testimony of Davis, who cooperated in exchange for a drastically reduced sentence. Messiah and Zuri Mugbuk were found guilty and sentenced to life. Granted executive clemency in 1985, Zuri was paroled in 1988. Messiah was less fortunate. He spent the next 33 years in the New Jersey prison system, where he endured yet another experiment that would have profound implications for incarcerated people everywhere. Messiah's incarceration in Trenton State Prison occurred shortly after its Management Control Unit, MCU, became operational. Launched in 1975 with BPP-BLA veteran Sandaya Akole, one of its first victims, this ultra-punitive prison within a prison was designed to perform the counter-revolutionary function that New York prisocrats had discussed in the immediate aftermath of Attica. A prison did not have to violate any rules to land in the MCU. They only needed to be Black and display certain intangible qualities that made them potential troublemakers, leaders, or incorrigibles in the eyes of the state. As Messiah explained, whether they was jailhouse lawyers, Afrocentric, Muslims, Pan-Africanists, Black nationalists, or whatever their affiliation, brothers were placed in MCU because of their political consciousness. With only a few brief interruptions, Messiah was held in MCU between 1976 and 2000, a total of 24 years. During our conversations about his life behind the walls, Messiah's narrations constantly shifted across time and carceral geographies. A story about the RX program might seamlessly bleed into a story about the MCU and vice versa. This narrative style accurately situates these programs as the fruit of the same putrid tree. Indeed, Activist scholars have traced the no-touch torture techniques employed in the MCUs like Trenton, as well as the enhanced interrogation techniques currently employed by the national security state as part of the global war on terror, to the CIA's brain warfare research. Narratives of sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, stress positions, humiliation, intimidation, exposure to extreme temperatures, perpetual lighting, punishing noise, pollution, severely restricted visitation and correspondence, and phone privileges, among other forms of profound trauma, emerge from the testimonials of those who have endured these sites within and beyond U.S. borders. In 1979, a few months before his codependent Assata Shakur escaped prison, Sandia Akole, a member of the Panther 21, was transferred from the MCU to Marion Federal Penitentiary in southern Illinois. Marion was one of the federal prison system's key penal laboratories, where behavior modification experiments similar to those explored in ACTC, Vacaville, and elsewhere were taking place. Back in 1973, Marion's warden had framed these experiments in explicitly counter-revolutionary terms. The purpose of the Marion Control Unit is to control revolutionary attitudes in the prison system and in the society at large. A decade later, federal prison cracks converted Marion to a permanent lockdown institution. What is needed in the federal prison system is an institution which incorporates the latest in technology and program features within its new concepts of control and security, noted a government report describing the transformation. For the next 23 years, Marion's entire captive population, many of whom understood themselves and were understood by the state to be political revolutionaries, were subjected to no-touch torture while confined to individual cages for 23 hours per day and sometimes longer. During the 1980s and 1990s, using the Trenton and Marion control units as their template, prison cracks proliferated similarly repressive carceral sites in virtually every state in the nation. According to the most recent and best available data on U.S. carceral activities or carceral practices, at least 80,000 people are held in some form of solitary confinement on any given day in the United States. An estimated 448,000 people have been isolated in the last 12 months. And these people are disproportionately Black and other people of color, people who are queer, and people with disabilities. These forms of isolation go by a variety of official euphemism: management control units, special housing units, secure housing units, communication management units, administrative maximum facility, restrictive housing, punitive segregation, disciplinary segregation, and administrative segregation, among others. While the names vary, the purpose remains consistent. As Nancy Kirshen, author of Out of Control, a 15-year battle against control unit prison, explains, we reasoned and asserted that just as prisons were to control rebellion in society, control unit prisons were to control other prisons, and that the holes or boxes within control unit prisons were used to control unit prisons, etc. Just boxes stuffed in boxes. Coupled with severe limits on what incarcerated people can read, listen to, and watch, this statecraft of isolation, torture, and manipulation reflects the chilling ongoingness of this war on the mind, a war that has the Black revolutionary at its center, but is promiscuous in its aims. And that's the end of chapter 6. There is an epilogue, which I encourage people to get the PDF and read it. And like I said, since I finished this this book, I am sending copies to my comrades locked up, and they will begin reading it to other people. So I encourage people to do the same. And if you don't have anyone linked to any kind of prison or institution, I encourage you to buy it yourself and to send it to other people, whether it be a neighbor or anybody. But there also is free PDF in the library as well. So there's that. So I hope that people enjoyed the reading. I hope people go back and listen to the rest of the chapters if they had not heard it. And I hope people share the free PDF as far and wide as possible. And I hope people get involved in connecting with people held captive by the state and to infiltrate these prison abolitionist groups who have been neutralized and pacified and repurposed for them to burn the prison down is exactly what they were supposed to be, and to set our people free by any means necessary in an ongoing protracted war against white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and the state. And with that, I tell us all to remind that we will see revolution in our lifetime, and let's get free.